Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Cyber Ireland Tuesday event in association with the Technical Industry Alliance. So welcome everyone. Just a quick plug, the TIA are having their annual TechFest conference this Thursday in Cork, and tickets are still available. So last month we had the West Chapter and ITAG discussing how to deal with an incident response. This month and this Tuesday, we have the South Chapter, and we have a few panelists here to talk about some of the recent challenges, but also looking 2 to 3 years out for our industry. So first of all, I'm their host today. My name is Cathal O'Donovan. I work for IBM based here in Cork, and I lead a development team responsible for threat management. So some of my other panelists today, and I'll just quickly hand off to them and they can say who they are. First of all, we'll hand off to Owen.
Hi, everybody. My name is Owen Wickens. I work in adversarial research in a startup called Hidden Layer. Previously from BlackBerry Cylance, used to do a lot of threat intel work, malware reverse engineering, but now look at kind of adversarial machine learning. Those of you that don't know, let's give a quick brief introduction. Hidden Layer is basically a startup that looks at safeguarding and securing machine learning and AI systems. Looking forward to chatting with you all.
Excellent. Thank you, Owen. Over to you, Finn.
Morning, guys. My name is Finn McLaughlin. I'm the head of security and operations for Effexco. I guess I'm probably looking around here. I probably look like I'm the oldest of the crew. I've over 30 years of experience. I started off as a developer. Now I'm working in the security field for the last few years. I'm going to give a shameless plug here. I'm also a board member for Cyber Ireland. I'm their academic chair, courtesy of a few years spent in UL. So some of my answers today will be both from an ISACA perspective and from Effexco perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. Darren.
Hey everyone. Darren Sexton's my name. I'm CEO at GuardU. We're a Cork-based cybersecurity vendor. We've developed a platform for delivering automated cybersecurity assessments, and we tend to work mostly with partners, MSPs, and more recently, cyber insurance companies.
Thank you, Darren. And finally, Brian.
Good afternoon, everyone. Brian Padden, as the picture behind me shows, I'm working for McKesson. So I lead up a team on global operational technology security, industrial control systems. I'm also responsible for information security risk management activities in Europe. McKesson is a Fortune 10 company headquartered in the US, probably one of the largest companies I've never heard of, because anytime I say to any of my friends or reminded, they ask me who I work for again, I have to give them the whole story about it. But if you had a COVID vaccine, we would have been involved in distributing it to you. We're very involved in distribution, medical supplies, and that whole area. So it's quite an interesting space to be in at the moment. Good to be here.
Thank you very much. Okay, so like I say, the intention here is kind of we're going to have 2 stages to this conversation. Stage 1 is about the recent challenges and some of the areas that we, the panelists, were thinking about is COVID. Not just COVID, but the challenge of working from home or remote, including someone on the call here today from Sherkin Island. The Ukraine situation also weighing heavily on our minds, and with everything related to the government, including the government frameworks that are bringing in, whether that be NIS or DORA, for example. So I'll start. So obviously I work for a very large US multinational, and like all of us, we were quickly sent home at the start of the pandemic. That immediately opened up the challenges of the digital transformation. So one of the very first things that people had to do was obviously VPN, and VPN became a big part of your connection into work, but also identity and access management and EDR. So obviously EDR, endpoint detection, became a bigger thing because you had to protect assets that were typically on site most of the day were now off site all of the time. So that was one technology that really took off during the pandemic, as well as, you know, zero trust and identity and multi-factor authentication and things like that. So that was a big change for us in IBM. I don't know, Brian, would you like to, or Fionn, were, you know, bigger companies, what was the impact on you of that remote working and that COVID situation?
I guess from our perspective, we were actually quite lucky. About a month before the train came down the tracks, we had actually done a test and sent everyone home. We kind of figured something might happen. So we did a full-blown test by sending people home in teams. It was brilliant. On top of that, then we'd actually started doing some, set our VPNs in place. So thankfully, because we were exposed to the China situation and some of the stuff was happening there, we had a bit of forewarning for that. But in fairness, now it's actually been really good at hindsight, because we have a lot of regulated systems within FEXCO. And so the regulator always asks, what's your BCP plan? The fact now that people work from home, they have alternate arrangements. It means that with the exception of my DR piece, all my BCP pieces are pretty much covered. So that's been a quite positive thing of the whole fiasco, I guess. But again, Teams has been a winner for us anyway.
Very good. Brian?
I guess we had two main strands of challenges, if you want to call them that. One being the same challenges that you just described, Carl, and Fionn articulated on as well, is how do you move your workforce from primarily being on site to working from home? And that was a huge logistical exercise in terms of even things like, we had a lot of task-based workers who would never have considered their role as being appropriate to work from home. So we had just the practical implications of trying to find laptops, because I mean, this was around the time when the semiconductor supply chain issues were starting to hit, and obviously they extended and got worse over COVID. So even just practical things like that, you know, training people up might sound somewhat innocuous. Well, you know, what training is required to work from home, but you've got to introduce people to VPN software and the whole element of, do they have sufficient you know, bandwidth? Can they work from home? Even right through to elements of health and safety. You know, I mean, it's a workplace in the office, and sometimes we try not to think about it like that, because that can open a whole other set of things you need to look at. So all those things, I think every company faced those, and it's like anything in a crisis, people just rally and get on board. The second strand was really the business challenge. So at the same time when COVID was percolating in the US, we had a lot of government contracts, and we were selected to participate in what the US government called Operation Warp Speed, which is essentially get vaccines to people, get PPE to hospitals, you know, that whole response. So we had to stand up over the course of about 4.5 months, 12 new distribution centers. So in scale, those would be, you know, probably half the size of the Aviva Stadium at a minimum, sometimes bigger than that. And we literally had to find space, build space, do whatever we do to get that supply chain running, to respond to the requirements of, you know, millions and millions of tons of PPE. And also the cold chain, supply chain that we already had to be extended and expanded to get the vaccines out there. So on the one hand, we had a whole workforce moving from, you know, nice and cozy in their offices, trying to make them still be productive, and then the additional business impact or business pressure of trying to respond to that as well, as while the whole world was burning, as everyone has experienced during COVID. So it was a very interesting time, but we got through it, and I think we're the better of it now in terms of some of the things we learned and some of the things we did.
So I think there's two important threads to that. You know, test and simulation. Obviously, you know, we're all advocates of that, whether it be DR testing, failover testing. We've all done that. So test and simulation. The government frameworks. I must say, when you talked about expanding that supply chain, I immediately just jumped to, my attack vector has jumped. All of these assets have suddenly become on stream, and now I've got this larger risk to manage. So it'll be interesting, Darren, to hear your point of view about managing risk in a minute or two from Guard.io's experience. But before we just jump there, you know, we have also had a war going on in the European space. We've seen you know, ransomware, malware we've seen both state actors and professionals ramp that activity up as well over the last couple of years. I'm sure that we've all been, you know, taking different approaches to that. You know, for me, one of the areas that we immediately had to double down on is our vulnerability management and risk management. So that, you know, we weren't leaving any zero-day threats behind us accidentally for some state actors or professionals to take advantage of. Did any of your 4 companies react to that Ukraine situation a bit differently?
I don't know about differently. I think we probably all had similar type of reactions. It was really just to understand your, as you call it, the attack surface. What do you have? What assets do you have in Ukraine? You know, there's the human element of it first and foremost. Obviously, people were, you know, there was a war on, so people were being displaced, people were being killed, and you have to be cognizant of that, the safety of personnel first. And then, you know, how do you react to that from a business perspective? But I think, and I know on this audience, we have a lot of, you know, obviously, I'd say a lot of technology professionals, some security people. I think the fundamentals across all these crises is that there is this, you know, consistent cooperative communication. I didn't mean to use 3 C's there, but I did, with the business in terms of these things that were, you know, that cybersecurity and even technology in general can't be just this, you know, conversation when something is going wrong. We need that partnership consistently. We, as technology professionals, security professionals, have to be speaking the language of the business, and we have to do that consistently. So when these things happen, we're not the guys they try to remember where we sit and where we are and who we are. That we're immediately being called into the conversation as peers and colleagues who understand the business and they understand our, you know, requirements, if you want to call them that, or the world we live in, which is about trying to protect the company. I think that's very important. The commonality for me, having seen these things over the years, is that if we're seen as a department, you know, you break glass in case of emergency, it's too challenging to spin everything up. It's too challenging to introduce ourselves. So we have to be, in good times, we have to be talking to each other as well, rather than just the crises. I would say that's the lesson I've learned.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to move to, you know, be enablers as well as the business transforms, rather than just putting restrictions in the way. You're absolutely right. Actually, Owen, I'd be interested to get your point of view as an adversarial researcher. What have you seen in the last couple of years around the state actors and their activities?
Right, yeah, I think it's been quite interesting to see that unfold. You know, interesting in quite a devastating way. I think we've seen obviously like huge amounts of commodity malware, things like botnets, QuackBot, TrickBot, Emotet, especially delivering a lot of stuff like that. Then, you know, I suppose when the Ukrainian war kicked off, you could definitely see, or at least felt from kind of our perspective, that things kind of moved from maybe a lot of work moved into the war effort there, right? I mean, they were launching cyber attacks, they were taking down particular targets within Ukraine. We kind of seen a little bit of a trend where that shifted. Now, I'm out of threat intel over the last year. I work in adversarial machine learning more so to speak these days. So when we came out of when we basically launched the company back in April of last year, the war was kind of an ongoing issue at that point. So it didn't change things as much for us, but as Brian said, it's you have to be very proactive with these things, right? Security has to be part of the conversation from the get-go, rather than being a thing you tack on after the fact. So I suppose that's kind of been the nature of the game with us when we're building out this remote workforce, that we kind of have all this in place, that regardless of where the adversary is coming from or what current events are in place, that we're kind of ready to deal with that.
Thank you. And Darren, you have some employees out there in the Ukraine, so you have a unique perspective to share.
Yeah, so a couple of the fellow founders in Garju are Ukrainian, so we have a long history with Ukraine, and we have an office in Kiev. So I was actually in Kiev. I think I left there on the Friday morning before the Tuesday that the Russians marched in. So I was out there just before it happened. And in the lead up to the invasion, we had been doing a lot of work right across Ukraine for about 1.5 years beforehand, doing a lot of assessments on a lot of the critical infrastructure companies, because I think, you know, they knew what was coming down the track, and they needed to be prepared. And I think it's important to remember that, you know, a lot of countries might have thought that Ukraine would have collapsed a lot quicker. Not that it has collapsed, but their defenses were fairly solid because they knew what was coming down the track. And we were doing assessments on, you know, we did their air traffic control, energy providers, gas providers, utility providers. So they were really working hard to make sure that their critical infrastructure wasn't taken down from the inside. And, you know, I just thought some of the comments were interesting there, because when the attacks did start coming, I suppose what we do is really about trying to reduce the attack surface. So the delivery mechanisms for malware, they can change. They'll change, you know, the bots. They'll change the delivery mechanism for getting in. But once an adversary gets inside the network, it always tends to do, a lot of the time, the same sort of things. You know, looks to escalate privileges, to try and, you know, perform lateral movement. You know, so what we focus on is making sure that if anybody does get in, that we have your vulnerabilities and locked down to a minimum, so we can really help you reduce your attack surface. So when they do get in, they have very little space to expand. And we were doing a lot of that across Ukraine for the last 2 years. But once the war hit, then again, you know, the personal stories kicked in. Everybody was displaced. You know, we had people in Poland, Spain, Germany, and it was kind of challenging to keep everybody up to date, communicate with everybody, and just grow the business, I suppose. But yeah, so
thank you, Darren. And I think just on that government framework, well, that critical infrastructure, Fionn, I know that you mentioned it earlier, government regulations are really driving kind of what you're thinking about now with NIS and DORA. Anything you'd like to share about that, and how government framework is getting you to think differently?
Well, I guess, as I said, we're heavily financial services, as well as we have some contracts with some government agencies from a managed service perspective as well. So right now, even before DORA and before the other stuff, there's an operational resiliency program underway, sponsored by the central bank. So we're in the midst of going through all our governance, all our security, all our operational pros and cons, and just working with some consultants right now. So there's nothing but more and more regulation coming our way. So, you know, start off with GDPR, we know the operational resiliency. So I guess from the good news, it forces you to think about things proactively rather than being hit afterwards. So from our perspective, we spend a lot of time finding the right suppliers to help us out with that. We're not the experts in these things, but at least we know where to find the experts. And so that's sort of my advice, is really, if you find someone out there that is good in a particular area, make friends with them and keep them close, because they're going to become very popular very soon.
Yeah, and I think my advice on government frameworks is get in early as they're being created, so that you can influence the outcome of them. You know, writing a document, but the implementation and the adherence to it always falls on us. So we need to be in there early. Would be my advice to that. So stage 2 of the conversation then is looking to the future, and you know, DORA is coming down the line, NIS2 is coming down the line. A lot of conversation going on about AI and how AI is going to change the way that we think. So we deliberately invited 2 startups into this conversation, and our 2 security vendors in the early stages, to give us a view, because startups come into this market for a simple reason. They're either looking to make something better, or they've got something new and novel to bring to the market. So one of the things that I am doing as a development leader, and it is, you know, from a threat perspective, is you know, bringing all of the telemetry to one place. So obviously the big data lake conversation, the buzzword in the industry is XDR right now. So X is for any type of event coming from any source. So network, for example, your firewall logs, bringing that all together. And the only way that I can bring all of that together, and not to open, lots and lots of cases for my analysts to look at, is to use AI and ML. And so we're bringing that into the product, or we brought that into the product already, and we're constantly maturing that. So for me, looking this year and out, it is that consolidating all of the alert telemetry that I have across my environment, putting that together with AI and ML, and launching value to the customer by saying, okay, we didn't open this case, we added to this case. Here's some more artifacts, here's some more findings, here's some enrichment that we've done for you so that you can prioritize and bring risk. So Owen, I know that you're in that space right now, so maybe we could get your view on why you did the startup. What is it, new and novel, or are you trying to solve something before?
Yeah.
What's your motivation?
Yeah, so I mean, AI is all around us, right? It's in everything. It's in your XDR solutions. It's in your ChatGPT, and by virtue, those ChatGPT things are in every single product, from your Teams to, even they're delivering to your iOS apps these days. But it's a massive thing. It's it approves your mortgage loans. It basically unlocks your phone. It's in absolutely everything you can imagine. And I suppose what we kind of looked at was the fact that ML and AI has been rolled out into everything meant that there was also the propensity for an attack surface there, because basically models can be attacked. They can be attacked, with ChatGPT through prompt injection, or they can be attacked using an inference attack, or sometimes even stolen simply by querying the model. So with the ubiquity of AI kind of around the world, we kind of looked at it and said, this is going to be something that is going to become very important. And I think, coincidentally, about 6 months after we launched, the whole ChatGPT thing blew up. And then it brought it into the wider conversation, where even people like my grandparents are asking me, what's ChatGPT and why am I seeing it everywhere? So with that, we kind of looked towards securing AI, because I suppose back in 2019 in Cylance, we actually suffered an adversarial attack against our AI model in our endpoint solution. And when this happened, we kind of realized that this was a much bigger problem than just for a cybersecurity product. This was going to be a problem that affected everybody equally, and especially with the democratization of AI throughout the world, I guess. So that's kind of the reason why we started the company, and it's been, I suppose, quite timely, quite fortunately, thankfully for us. But also, it's quite an important thing that we believe really is going to become one of the big frontiers over the next couple of years, certainly.
Very good. And Darren, over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, AI is definitely in our thoughts and in our roadmap going forward. Currently, what we do is, so we've developed an automated cybersecurity assessment platform where we remotely gather data from each device on a network. We encrypt that and we upload it to our analytics engine. And our analytics engine is made up of our own proprietary threat models that we've written ourselves. And so it's mapped against our threat models to produce an automated report within a matter of hours. So I suppose our value proposition is we reduce the time, the resources, and the costs associated with a very comprehensive cybersecurity assessment, evidence-based security assessment, by up to 90%. But going forward, I think our ultimate goal would be to build our own neural network, where the engine is recognizing vulnerabilities as they appear in operating systems and different systems like Linux, and then learning to write its own models so it can spot what's going on. And that's really our long-term goal, is to develop this neural network machine learning platform where we can generate models as it learns on the spot. And that's really where we're going with it.
Wow, that's very exciting. And to Brian, what are you thinking about as a consumer 2 to 3 years out?
I think we're all reacting to a certain extent to what Owen and Darren just mentioned, I guess from a cyber perspective, you'd hope that while, this is another significant tool in the armory of the bad guys, that we'll be able to look at, I suppose the vendor ecosystem and our own abilities to be able to, not just respond to that, but maybe we might get ahead for once in this challenge. I think one of the key things, because we talk about, new threats or new technologies that are coming into vision, and what they mean, but I guess it's timely to remember there's a lot of things that haven't gone away either. So we're all aware of the Facebook, the Meta ruling that came out this week, the challenges there on GDPR. And for those who aren't aware, I mean, essentially, Helen Dixon, the Irish DPC, has basically said that Facebook have to stop transferring data, or sorry, Meta have to stop transferring data to the US within 5 months, which is huge, because any company that's, any Irish-based multinational with operations in the US, we've all, I think at this stage, done significant amounts of due diligence and work on that. But I think while there is, the challenge at the moment is that with Schrems 2, there is no agreement to transfer your data from the EU to the US. And while that, kind of gap still exists, a lot of the work that's been done in light, the rules haven't changed, but in light of that, significant ruling, some of us may need to go back and look at that again. And I think that's a challenge as well, in that existing, government frameworks, laws, regulations, I think they tend to come into focus for a while. They become popular, and then companies look at them because your board is suddenly reading about it somewhere. We all know, we've all got the phone call from a senior stakeholder who's been at a conference or read something about something like that, and you're kind of going, okay, we're covered, but I need to revisit it. So there's a few things like that coming up, I think, that we need to be cognizant of as well, that are existing but haven't, completely gone away, and the landscape changes. And I guess ChatGPT will come into that as well, because it's pulling from a huge pool of data, and even companies realizing that if you use the browser-based one, and this is a challenge for all companies, that our employees are experimenting with this, we all are. It's understanding what information are you making publicly accessible by putting a question into ChatGPT. If you're using an API in your own private cloud, then that's different because it's somewhat controlled. But people are, inevitably throwing out there something like, if we have this much revenue in this particular business and this balance sheet says this, what does it mean? And ChatGPT will give you an answer. That information is now out there because if you're using the public-based one. So it's considering stuff like that. But look, it's always a challenge.
I think that is actually a very good one, because it kind of reminds me, if you're not paying for a service, you are the service. And so, you do write that. If, I remember years ago, someone warning me that if I was searching for a patent and the patent came back with nothing, someone knew that I had searched for a patent and they were going to try and get there ahead of me, So I think it is a good example of, if you're not paying for the service, you are the service, and your data will be used. So thank you for that, Brian. Fionn, some things that you're thinking about 2 to 3 years out?
God, I'm scared. I'm thinking of this AI body out there who was going to say, look, give me all the companies that have revenues of greater than 500,000 or 500 million, and what's the best way into them, right? That scares me, because they will be able to learn. They'll know what the attack vectors are. They'll be able to learn from them. And then you'll have your own AI on your side. It'll be the battle of the bots, right? So you've got your own AI then, which will be traversing your network, trying to figure out where you have vulnerabilities on one side versus the external threat actors coming in saying, well, where are their vulnerabilities? And I guess, which can you subscribe to that gives you the quicker results? And that's what scares me from a security perspective.
The other thing quickly, Carl, just NIST 2, you touched on it earlier, but I'm sure people on the call are aware, but NIST 1 was fine to a certain extent, but you kind of opt in or opt out and say you're not an operator of critical infrastructure, for example. But NIST 2, the EU EC will say, this is our definition, and you are an operator of critical infrastructure. Therefore, you must adhere to certain elements of NIST 2. And that's a bit of a game changer. I don't know if companies are fully aware of that yet. And the parallels with what's recently happened, we mentioned with Meta, is that you can now see EC and EU, using its muscle to a certain extent more than it has before. So I think that's something we have to be we need to assess it properly as organizations where it might apply to us. I think it's going to be more wide-ranging than people think.
I'd have to agree with you. I think GDPR did absolutely trigger a reaction from the industry, and it definitely became even your local GAA club had to change how it was operating, you know, from WhatsApp because of GDPR concerns. NIS2 is even bigger, and I do think it's going to have a significant impact on how we do our business. And just back to what Fionn was saying, the battle of the bots is absolutely something that's in front of us. But more importantly, the way that you said it is, it's going to be a results-orientated business. The professional cyber hackers, you know, want a return for the investment that they do. And you know, we've probably most people, well, hopefully not most people on the call, but the e-flow texts that you've been getting over the last couple of weeks, maybe, you know, to say that you've an outstanding, you know, bill with e-flow, those URL forward on, you know, get someone to pay them €2 for a bill. It all sounds real, you know, especially if you are using, you know, the motorway to Cork to Dublin, or, you know, the M50. So the way that the attackers are making things relevant to your life, you know, whether a mass marketing one like the e-flow scenario or just a little bit of social engineering, is really, really changing the game. You know, if they do manage to attack, you know, high value target through social media, and get that information and go on and on and on, I do really worry about you know, what am I posting? What am I talking about? What role am I talking about? Because they can use that information to a weak part in the supply chain to get in and maybe, as they say, escalate privileges or make lateral movements or make different contacts. You know, we all saw the invoice scams that have been going on as well. So it's a very dynamic environment that we're working in, I think, you know, right now and for the last couple of years, and I don't see it slowing down. Just to the participants,
yeah.
If you do want to ask us some questions, there is a Q&A function. Owen has pinged it, so if people want questions, please start to interact now. We've probably got another few minutes if you do want to do some Q&A. All right, sorry, Brian, back to you.
Yeah, no, just a quick one. I was just going to say, you know, for the non-cyber people on the call, I guess we need to be careful as well. Everything you say is absolutely accurate. That we need to be careful that people don't feel there's no control. I think the fundamentals will always be the consistent protection to a certain extent. We control understanding your assets, you know, patching the environment, being aware where the challenges are within reason. And to your point, the social engineering, the cyber training, you know, consistency on that. I think if you keep your hygiene levels reasonably high, you'll go a significant way to protecting yourself. It's like the analogy of, you know, the burglar who wants to get into a house. If he sees a house with gates and a dog and stuff, then he might move on to the next one. So, you know, you can do a lot just by doing the basics. The basics aren't easy. They're very unsexy, but those are the things that I think that for people who are who start freaking out when they hear all this, it's like, do that stuff and you'll be in a reasonable place at least.
Yeah, I think some of those basics for me right now, vulnerability management, multi-factor authentication, managing my firewall, knowing what my assets are, absolutely none of those are sexy. Trying to explain MFA to my mother in her 80s so that she can use her web app for her bank, you know, this is normal, you know. So you're absolutely right. Hygiene is critical. And that's why I think it goes back to that test simulations, one of the first things that we mentioned about. So important. You've got to put time aside to decide what you're going to do and practice what you're going to do, because it comes down to, you know, as the CISO starts to participate on the board meetings, it all comes down to risk. What risk is the company willing to tolerate? And companies need to think about, you know, especially with NIS there, am I part of a critical supply chain? And if I get a disruption there, what are the knock-on effects of it? You know, so big deal.
Can I add as well, Carl? You know, Brian mentioned for the non-cyber people on the call, it's also important for the non-cyber people on the call to realize that maybe their cyber insurance is, not something that's necessarily going to get them out of a hole if they are breached. And that, going forward, cyber insurance companies are either pulling back from cyber, or they're making it a lot more difficult for companies to get cyber coverage. And even if you do have cyber coverage, you really need to understand what it's covering. I mean, a very basic cyber insurance policy may only cover the cost of bringing in a cyber expert to get you back up and running, and may also cover the cost of engaging with the solicitor to tell you what your GDPR compliance, what you need to do, write a letter to your customers telling them you've been breached, things like that. It will not cover any loss of earnings. It will not cover, anything you've lost monetary wise. So it is something that people need to be aware of as well.
Thank you, Darren. So we've got 3 questions on the Q&A. I might start to put them out to the panelists. So Vladimir, with all of this AI talk, where does this leave aspiring cyber pros pivoting from other industries like sales and IT? More specifically, what skills should we focus on to stay relevant in this space? Who wants to take that one?
I presume you're talking about pivoting into kind of AI-centric roles. I think like AI at the minute, and in terms of how it's affecting a lot of like security professional roles, is the use of these tools to enhance their jobs already. Like we're looking at things like Google SecPAM, which is able to kind of analyze, vast amounts of events, and in a similar way to that Carl was talking about with, AI over XDR, and be able to understand and triage stuff. I think at the minute it's quite not an auxiliary thing, but it's an additive thing to typical roles. Certainly no harm to kind of brush up on kind of like high level overview things of AI, understanding, training data, how that, the training data is computed into a model, and then how things are, queried, sent into the model. Understanding that process and understanding like the importance of that data and data labeling, etc., is quite underrated, but is really important, with especially when you're thinking of things like, kind of as Brian was saying actually, about when your data, when you're sending data to a model, and that data is then either taken out of the hands of the company, it's kind of understanding both the how the models are being developed, but also how they're being used within operations environments as well. So having that context is really important, really powerful, for you to kind of understand and utilize AI to the best of its ability, but also using it safely, so that you're not leaking secrets, or kind of giving stuff away to other companies.
Thank you. I'm going to merge 2 questions together. What is the biggest difficulty SOC teams are facing at the moment from an AI point of view? And then what challenges should customers face if CISOs plan to outsource their SOC operations? I'm going to put that out there. So what's the biggest challenge that SOC teams are facing at the moment from an AI point of view?
I think it's very, we're still in a very early phase, if you like. So I don't know if we fully understood or considered what the challenges from AI are from a SOC perspective. To touch on Owen's point, I guess there's advantages to it, because we do, the biggest challenge to any SOC is the noise. How do you see your way through the noise? How do you understand what's worth looking at, what isn't? AI, I think, will help us with that. I mean, it's been around for a while, not to plug IBM, Carl, but like Watson 5-6 years ago was doing some of this, and it did help. I read SOCs in the past where that was actually useful, and other tools exist. And that helps because it cuts down the noise and gives you more to look at. I think the challenges, my immediate reaction will be, SOC challenges will be on the social engineering side initially, I think, and a similar type of, computer generated automated response summary. What I mean by that is things that look like, so the biggest vector with social engineering is something looks like something that is non-threatening or encourages you to react in a way that the attacker wants. I think from a computer generated perspective on a technology side, in other words, what are the machines doing differently? I think what we'll start to see is similar things from a SOC perspective. So something that looks like it's a false positive, something that looks like you shouldn't be concerned about it, is something that you should be concerned about. So it's the same premise of what's real and what isn't. To me, that's probably the most immediate challenge to SOCs. I think the whole thing is going to evolve to a level we probably don't understand yet. And to the skills question, I don't know. I think there's going to be a lot of tenuous jobs. Like you've seen jobs at the moment that are very well paid for curating kind of learning language model information. But they're quite tenuous because I think the technology will advance quite quickly. It will learn how to do that, and then that job's gone. So I wouldn't be purely focusing on how to make a career in AI necessarily. There is good careers in it, but from a security professional perspective, I think we're still in the early stages of understanding what it means. But
I might just add one quick thing there, because I suppose had the kind of not unique experience, but an interesting experience of working with the Cylance endpoint product, which was dealing with malware, basically, and it's an anti-malware endpoint product. But what we were like, what ends up happening with a product that relies quite heavily on machine learning is, as you said, you do have a lot of false positives, right? And that requires fine-tuning the model, requires labeling that data. So, this is also going to be applicable in places like SOC, right? Is if it hasn't seen it before, will it be able to protect against it? So I'd imagine that there's also going to be a slight operations change within the places like SOCs, and especially people who are just using these models for triaging events and everything, that these models will need to be fine-tuned and kept up to date. So as we know, it's a cat and mouse game that kind of continuously evolves. So I just imagine there'll be kind of an operational point to data labeling, maybe like on-site fine-tuning for if you have a model that you're sourcing from somewhere else, you're then tuning up internally. Well, yeah, great points.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that. Yeah, we need the models to make the SOCs not as noisy, and then to enrich. We definitely need those. I'm going to put out one more question out to the panel. Darren, I'm going to pick on you on this one. How are companies treating or transferring the risk that AI poses to the company's data or to their intellectual property? Put you on the spot, I know.
Well, repeat that again.
How are companies treating or transferring the risk that AI poses to the company's data or to our intellectual property?
Oh, you have put me on the spot there. I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that for a second. Has anyone else got an answer for that one?
Yeah, anybody else got a thought? Well done to Thomas Caffney. He's got his own flummoxed.
There are some tools out there that already do some of that, right? And again, I know we're not supposed to name tools, right? But Darktrace, for example, uses AI to figure out the noise from the good stuff, right? They have specific models for, say, ransomware, so on. So there are some AI tools already available to allow you to look at your network. Now, the problem is tools like that are only north-south traffic, right? So if you have a bunch of VMs sitting in a physical machine, it's not going to monitor that. So you got to be careful, but there are some tools out there that will help you right now.
I think it's an evolving thing as well. Like as we were talking about earlier with data going into ChatGPT models, like we didn't really think of that as an issue so much at the beginning, right? And like now it's evident that sending your data outside your environment is going to be dodgy, right? But to a typical end user, it may not be as apparent up front, right? So I think with AI and with all this, we're feeling out what the threat landscape is right now. And I think it's going to be a continual learning process, as well as the fact that, as we were talking about NIST, we were talking about, the European Council, they're bringing in a lot of regulation stuff around this to kind of define the space, as well as to standardize, the terminology that we use, and to basically enforce kind of, more rigid understanding of where your data is going, how it's being used, and the applications that the model is going to be used in as well. Like we just saw that with the amendments to the AI Act in the European Union, where they're talking about, having prohibited models that, things like using facial recognition on public environments and stuff like that, and which are now going to be prohibited. And I think it's going to be a regulation forward approach realistically, that then companies will then adopt within their own environments. just purely from a kind of like, it's such a wild west at the minute that, you know, that we don't really have clear answers to this just yet. But I think regulation and standardization will help shore things up in the.
There was news out of the US last week on exactly that, you know, that they missed the boat with social media regulation, that they're not going to miss the boat with AI. And I also think there was an article last week, I can't remember where it came from, but they actually said we're at that tipping point where Steve Jobs arrived out with the first iPhone, and, you know, mobile phone technology and what we use mobile phone technology just took off. I think they also said that this is the tipping point for AI and how we use it in the enterprise. So yeah, it's definitely an exciting time. What's interesting is every single question that we had some reference to AI. So it's definitely on people's minds. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up if unless our panelists have anything else to say.
We just had one thing, right? And this is probably with my ISACA hat on, right? You've got all these new regulations heading at you, and unless you have one central framework to be able to manage those, you're not going to be able to do it efficiently. So whatever that framework is, whether it's NIST CFS, whether it's COVID-19 or whatever, right? I would look to be picking a framework and using that to cut down on the amount of rework you have to do across the environment.
Very good suggestion. Yeah, very good suggestion.
Yeah, and I think just on that again, I think frameworks absolutely agree with Phil on that. The regulations will come into play. They always tend to be behind, unfortunately. Sometimes ones that are ahead probably irrelevant to a certain extent. I mean, you can see some of the improvements even done by the vendors. I know in ChatGPT version 1, you could, and I saw this in a demo, I didn't do this myself, you could ask it, how do I make a bomb in my kitchen? And it would tell you. In the later versions, it'll tell you, my programming doesn't allow me to tell you that. So now the bad guys aren't going to go through the front door, they're going to pull the information from the back door. So it's not really that relevant, but still, the less people that have that information generally available to them, whatever nefarious act you're talking about, then the better. So I think the vendors themselves will improve the technology because they need to, but also regulation will help. But it's not going to be, you know, the be all and end all. It's those, you know, not to labor the point, but it's those foundational stuff, control what you can control the controllables, that will help us, generally speaking, be reasonably secure. No one's going to be completely secure at any stage, but I think that will at least give us allow us some opportunity to sleep at night for those of us in the cyber arena.
All right. Okay. Any last thoughts from anyone else? No. Okay. So I'm just going to wrap up again. Thank you to the TIA for participating in today's event, and best of luck with your conference Tech Fest on Thursday. Tickets still available. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to Cyber Ireland.
Thanks, guys. Thanks.